recent episode of the Joe Rogan Experience, podcaster Joe Rogan pushed Pennsylvania Senator John Fetterman to discuss immigration and its political ramifications. Let's watch.
They had an opportunity to do a comprehensive border, bipartisan, and that went down because Trump he declared that's a bad deal after it was negotiated with the other side.
But didn't that deal also involve amnesty, and didn't that deal also involve a significant number of illegal aliens being allowed into the country every year? I think it was 2 million people. So it was still the same sort of situation, and their fear is exactly what I talked about, that these people will be moved to swing states, and that will be used to essentially rig those states and turn them blue forever.
Well, I'm not really sure if that's what's in play. I think it's really it's important that we have to have an honest conversation.
But doesn't that seem logical, though? If you have a significant number of people that are being moved into swing states that have come across the border illegally, and then you've provided them with all these services, you provided them with food stamps, EBT, you've provided them with housing. You could, if you gave those people amnesty and allowed those people to vote, and it was very organized. You're talking about 75,000 votes over a few counties that switched everything over to the Republicans. You could see how you import 10 million people over the course of 4 years illegally, and then move a significant number of them to swing states, and then provide them with all these services, and then give them a path to citizenship. You could essentially rig those states.
Undeniably, immigration is changing our nation. I mean, I haven't spent a lot of time in Texas, but it's very clear that immigration has remade Texas, and I think it's for a good.
Credit to John Fetterman for going on Joe Rogan and saying a lot of things I think are pretty insightful. Lately, he's a kind of culturally moderate voice on the Democratic Party. But yeah, here grappling with the reality, and this is the conservative accusation that the immigrants are going to be brought in, and that this is going to be, that first they're getting all these benefits and housing, etc. That I don't want to offer them. I'm fine with immigrants coming in. I want them to come in legally, but I don't want them coming in for handouts or abusing the social services. I want them to come in and work, and then that's fine. And if they become citizens, they can vote. And I'm not particularly worried about their voting practices because I actually know that many of these immigrants are conservative rather than liberal. And so there's a little bit of fatalism on the Republican side about immigration because what we're finding is that particularly Latino immigrants from down south are in many cases culturally conservative and anti-socialist and are less hostile to American values than many affluent, well-educated white and black people who are born here. But that's not to dispute the point that if you bring in 10 million people and put them in the swing states and create some dependency for them on the welfare state, then maybe they would be voting for Democrats.
I think this is all on the assumption that, number one, they're going to swing states. There's no real evidence of that. Most of the migrants that are being bused and flown from Texas are being flown to states like New York and Pennsylvania, and because that's been pretty out there and open that they want to put the burden on the cities.
Well, Pennsylvania's a swing state.
Well, you're right. Pennsylvania is a state.
The swing state.
But they're not voting, number one. These are not legal immigrants. They can barely find housing right now. They were just allowed, at least in New York, to work jobs like Uber and Lyft and delivery services.
Which is great. I'm all for that. That's great.
And it's actually improved our job numbers. I mean, the last jobs report, there was a very clear indication that some of these immigrants who've come here who don't have status yet have actually improved our jobs report, at least for low-wage jobs. Of course, they're also not getting a minimum wage in some cases. I mean, there's all sorts of complications. But even then, the swing states, just to finish the point, a lot of these swing states don't have the services that Joe Rogan is alleging. So I think sometimes Joe Rogan...
Well, they have food stamps.
Some do, but they're not for people who are not documented. It really depends on the state you're in. And I think that's my issue with Joe Rogan is sometimes he's making a point and it sounds really thoughtful, but he kind of veers off into conspiracy land without providing real evidence to the point where, John Fetterman, frankly, I don't think he was prepared for it in that he's not used to hearing these kinds of things regularly. And you can have valid concerns in reality about immigration and a real plan. And like you said, his generalizing all Latinos. First off, the majority of migrants who are coming over the border right now are actually coming from China, which is a fascinating discovery that CBS made this year. So we assume that they're all Latinos. some are Haitian, some are from Venezuela, some are from other parts of South America, Honduras, Guatemala, where they all have complicated relationships with supposed socialist or leftist governments. I wouldn't say that Venezuela is really left, but that's a whole other conversation. But they do, like you said, they have more conservative values. And so I also get annoyed that there's this generalization of a group of people, which shows me how little work he's doing in understanding who these immigrants are that he's so afraid of.
Well, but there's also even if they're not voting, we always do have to remember, because undocumented or illegal immigrants do count for the census data that determines how how much congressional representation and then how many electoral votes. So even if they are highly concentrating in more, not exclusively in blue states, but it does tip more in a blue direction. Obviously, there's a lot of them in Texas, so them being in Texas is a boost to Republican congressional representation. But California is a boost to Democratic, California, New York, and Illinois, the other main states where immigrants go to. If they get a higher population over time, even if the immigrants aren't voting, they're raising the number of electoral college votes that those states get. That could be a contribution to Democratic, to a good thing for the Democratic Party, and I think that's the smart version of that argument.
Except, Ian, and I hear you, that is true, but the numbers are not always fully accurate, because a lot of folks who are undocumented do not want to speak to authorities. They don't even when crimes happen, it's highly undocumented. The crimes are undocumented because the undocumented people feel distrust with, as they should, with authorities, because they could, lose their jobs, lose their homes, be deported, depending on where they are. And that's the whole concept of sanctuary cities, is having this system in place where it is easier to have an accurate count, even issuing licenses to some of them so that they know how many folks are in the community, how many resources to provide, have more accountability to law enforcement or in other services. Folks don't feel comfortable going to government because they're afraid they're going to get busted, essentially, and deported.
Well, I don't feel comfortable talking to the government because I'm distrustful of them, and I don't want, when it comes up with a census and they want to ask you, all sorts of invasive personal questions, just count us and move on. Yeah,
and it's general, the census too. Like, how many different ethnic groups are like, I don't want to be lumped in with Anglo-Saxons, and so there's a lot of other cultural stuff that's happening where you have different groups saying like, I feel like I'm not being represented in the census, or I'm half Latino, half half Asian, or it's complicated. So we just don't have a deep understanding of identity in this country.
Well, and a lot of people want to just identify as American, or there are Latino people who don't even like that, saying this is not different from white and would just identify as American.
I think it depends on what generation.
That comes out of the census. All right, coming up next, Peanuts the squirrel murdered by the deep state. We're going to talk about that. Stay tuned. More Rising right after this.